So good day, folks. Today we're going to talk about something super important for anybody who wants to grow food in soil. We want a soil that works, a soil that drinks water, that has nutrients in it to feed the plants, that breathes air, because most of the beneficial organisms that live in soil breathe air just like you and me. Now that's not just earthworms, it's also fungi and a whole host of different organisms. Some are microscopic, some are macroscopic. The deal is, healthy soil isn't just a mineral. It's a living process. It's an ecosystem composed of a multitude of different living organisms that work together to make the soil good, to make the soil make a good place for plants to grow. It's a living process. Good garden soil copies nature. If you look in a forest, on the ground, you never see any bare spots. It's always covered in mulch. It's always covered in leaves and various detritus and debris that comes down from the plants, the trees. This gives a protective layer on the soil. So these are leaves and mostly plant debris, but there's also a 5% contribution from animals in the form of manure. So here we're talking about manure from partridges and deer and rabbits and birds and bears and raccoons and all of that stuff. They contribute an element that makes the whole thing work. It takes the organisms of decomposition and the nitrogen that's going to transform all of that organic matter into rich humus. So what's the recipe to make compost? Well, check this out. We got 20 parts of carbon for 1 part of nitrogen. That's 95% of carbon-rich material, which would be leaves and hay and straw, shredded paper, cardboard, all kinds of things like that that are rich in carbon. And 5% that comes from manure or other nitrogen-rich materials, which could include fresh grass clippings, shredded fresh leaves, coffee grinds, all kinds of things like that. So your 2 ingredients that you're using, or you're going to have your carbon-rich material, you put down a thick layer of carbon-rich material and a thin layer of manure, a thick layer of leaves, a thin layer of fresh grass clippings, a thick layer of hay, and a thin layer of manure. 100% of living organisms are composed of carbon molecules. Now that means that everything that was once alive can be composted. Now this includes meat, but the problem with meat is it's so rich in nitrogen that it tends to make your compost stinky. That's what happens when you have too much nitrogen. It gets smelly and it tends to lose a lot of its volume. So what happens is that a lot of the mass that's in there is reconverted back into carbon dioxide, back into the atmosphere, and also methane and other similar kind of organic gases. And that's not what we want to do. We don't want it to go back into the air. We want it in our garden, right? Where it's going to do a lot of good. Now, a second problem that comes with meat in your compost is that it might attract raccoons and skunks and maybe bears, cats, stray cats will get in there, so that's why we don't recommend meats and fats and dairy products in your compost. It's not that it's not going to work. It's just that it can attract problems to your compost pile. So proper balance is very important. That 20-to-1 proportion is so important to maintain in order to make a maximum amount of compost while minimizing the amount of carbon that returns to the atmosphere. Now we talked about carbon and we talked about nitrogen. Those are 2 of the 4 ingredients that we need. We also need water and we need air, oxygen. You see, the compost has to be a little bit moist, kind of like a wet sponge there. After you squeezed out most of the water, it's still a little bit moist to the touch. That's how you want your compost. Not too wet, not too dry. If it's too wet, there won't be any oxygen. It'll choke off the oxygen, and all of the aerobic bacteria, those bacteria that are good for soil, they get choked out and they get replaced by anaerobic bacteria that don't breathe oxygen, but also cause problems and disease and kind of issues with plants. and they also, anaerobic bacteria tend to smell bad. So if you notice that your compost is cold and stinky, it might be because there's too much water in there, maybe too much nitrogen, but definitely probably too much water. So the solution to that is just to turn it once more and fluff it all up and get some more air in there. And it's a good idea, once you're finished your compost, building your compost pile, to add, it's a good idea to add a tarp on top to protect it from the rain, protect it from too much sunshine too. You don't want it to dry out, and you don't want it to get too wet, just to keep it at that nice, perfect level. So now you made your compost pile. It's at least 1 cubic meter. That's 3 feet tall, 3 feet wide, 3 feet deep. That's your minimum. You can go, I tend to go a little bit bigger than that. I make my compost piles anywhere between 4 and 6 feet tall. You want to make it taller than wide. It works better. So when you have your balance right, you can expect your compost to start getting warm. You can expect temperatures to reach around 60 degrees Celsius. Now, that behaves pretty much similar to when you get a fever. When you get a cold or a flu, you get sick and you get a fever. Your body temperature rises so much that your virus or your bacteria that's making you ill can't survive those temperatures, and they go away, and you feel better. Well, compost does a similar thing. It raises temperature so much that only the beneficial bacteria can survive in there. All the negative bacteria, all the anaerobic bacteria pass away. And also several diseases and blights and weed seeds and all kinds of other problems that might be in the organic matter in your compost pile also get cooked. 60 degrees Celsius that it tends to reach is warm enough to nuke most things. So when you weed your garden, you can feel free to throw all of those weeds into your compost pile. It'll break down. If there's seeds in it, most of them are gonna get cooked and not gonna be viable anymore. Most, not all, but it's pretty good. And the more often you turn your compost pile, like fluff it all up and mix it all over again, the more thorough the cook will be. So your compost gets warm. The temperature rises. It reaches 60 degrees Celsius. It stays there for a few days, and then it starts to cool off. At that point, once your compost pile is cooled down again, you'll notice that the inside of your compost pile is starting to look different. Things are happening, but the outside is not decomposed at all. So this is the point where you would turn your compost. Usually that means that you would take layers off your compost, make another pile right next to it, and just transfer everything piece by piece and mix all the outside stuff that still is undecomposed. Mix it all in with all the stuff that's in the inside that's full of those bacteria that are hungry now. Well, you just give them more food and more air so they can get back to work, rewarm that compost pile, get hot again, and it'll cook those seeds and all those different problems on the outside. It'll take all of that stuff and it'll make sure to cook that too, and you'll have a much more thorough. Now, some people are more ambitious than others, and they'll turn it, 3, 4, 5 times before they use it in their compost before they use it in their garden. I garden in order to save time and money. So I've found that just turning it once is enough. I usually have multiple compost piles on the go. So if I get a pile if I get some material that's not quite decomposed enough, I'll just put that aside and I'll use that in my next compost pile. And I'll just take all of the good, rich, dark stuff that's pretty well broken down, and I'll transfer that into my garden. Now, sometimes you'll find some bits of wood, and that's okay. Sometimes you'll find some pieces of leaves that are still somewhat recognizable, and that's okay. But for the most part, you'll find that it's dark, it's beautiful, it's rich, it smells like forest floor, it doesn't stink. Then you know that your compost is ready to use. It doesn't have to be perfect like it is in the bags that you buy at the store. Homemade compost is a little rougher than that, and it works just fine. So, how do you use your compost? Well, I like to use compost like a mulch. So the nice and dark decomposed stuff, I'll just bring that in on a new garden or on in early spring or in the fall. I'll usually add about a 2 to 3 inch layer of compost on the surface, and that's all it takes to keep a garden healthy. So you can open up a little hole in the compost, plant your seed or your seedling down in the soil underneath, and then bring back that compost around it. Or you can just take it in a garden bed that maybe has plants, but they're kind of the soil is looking kind of bare and wants to dry out. You can add a layer of compost like that around your plants just to prevent evaporation. And then every time it rains or every time you water your garden, your plants get fed that nice compost tea that leaches down and penetrates right down into the deepest layers of the root zone of your plants. Now, good garden soil lets water seep in nice and deep, and plant roots can grow deep. But in soil that's not functional, it tends to not really absorb water very well. And so the plant roots tend to just sit close to the surface where they're very vulnerable to evaporation. So that's where, a good layer of compost on the surface will help, maintain good humidity levels, and would also help your soil to improve over time as worms come up from underneath and they eat that compost. They make tunnels up and down. That opens air passages and passages for water. And you'll notice that over time, if you don't till your garden too often and break that structure, your garden will get better and better and better over time. It'll perform better. It might not look like you're used to, but your plants will see the difference and you'll notice the difference in their performance. So basically, you feed your soil at the surface. That's how it prefers to be fed. Soil in nature is always fed on the surface. Material falls on the surface, it decomposes there, and the nutrients leach into the ground and feeds the soil life and the plants. So if we copy that in our garden, we're going to see much better performance than regular tillage, which breaks up soil structure, puts in too much oxygen, reduces soil carbon, and reduces soil life over time. So what I'm talking about here is no-till gardening methods. And it's kind of counterintuitive to think that the more you work your soil, the less functional it becomes. But that's been my experience in the last 20 years of gardening that I've been doing. I've tried all kinds of different methods, and this no-till gardening is not comparable at all with all the other. I threw away my tiller. The difference is remarkable. The amount of work is much reduced when you don't till, and the plants like it better. So you want to see the difference in performance between no-till garden soil and regularly tilled garden soil? Check this out. See, I water my garden and the water disappears. I water the garden and the water disappears. That's the difference. For soil that started out being heavy clay that didn't drink water at all, that's pretty good. That's the difference. No-till gardening makes soil that works. So now we're going to demonstrate what's called the slate test. This tests how resilient your soil is in the presence of water. So here we've got 2 soil samples, one taken from a garden, an organic garden, but that's tilled every season. And the second soil sample was taken from my garden, which hasn't been tilled in 10 years, with only a 2-inch layer of compost every fall, covered with a tarp for the off season, and just planted like regular in the spring. So when we put those 2 soil samples in water, we see what happens. A few bits of material falls off both of them, but the tilled soil can't hold its structure. It disintegrates, it falls apart. You see it snowing, it's degrading, all kinds of materials, the soil is falling off, the nutrients are falling off of it. And you see that it just crumbles and falls to the bottom of the jar. This represents what we see in our waterways, which have become so choked with sedimentation that comes mostly from agricultural lands. So what does that mean? Well, salmon and trout, they need deep, cold, cool water. They need those deep pools in their waterways. But with all of this sedimentation, those deep pools are filled in. There's no more room for trout. There's no more room for salmon. And they go away. Things don't have to be this way. There are better ways of doing it. Excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is contributing to climate change. But that carbon is precisely the stuff that plants use to build their tissue. That means that when we take all of that plant debris and we transform it into compost and we put it on our soil, it gets transformed, it gets sequestered in that garden soil. It's a stable way of sequestering atmospheric carbon in soil. And on top of that, not only does it reduce carbon from the atmosphere, it actually creates a system where you have food grown right in your backyard, within walking distance of your table. And that means that you no longer have to transport your food from halfway across the globe. You no longer need a truck, ships, and trains, and all kinds of transportation using gas, contributing to atmospheric carbon. So when you're gardening at home, the source of your food is within walking distance. Now that's one of the superpowers of living in the country. The Kent Regional Service Commission offers two different composters for a very reasonable price. Here we've got the traditional earth machine. You just open up your top there and you can throw all of your kitchen scraps in there. That'll be your banana peels and your carrot peels, potato peels, and leftover macaroni, rice, whatever. Throw that in there, and then you want to add, because that stuff is going to be reasonably rich in nitrogen. Then you want to add a thick layer of carbon-rich material to make sure that it's balanced. So that can be, some dried leaves. It can be some shredded paper. It could be newspaper, cardboard. It could be, sawdust even. And then you just add layer per layer per layer until you're filled up right up to the brim. So basically, you're kind of making it like a lasagna. A thick layer of noodles, thin layer of sauce. Thick layer of noodles, carbon-rich noodles, a thin layer of nitrogen-rich sauce, right? Now here we've got the green cone digester. Now this is a very different strategy. This is a composter for folks who've got, they're always gardening in the same garden bed, but don't want to do a whole lot of work. This, you install it in the middle of your garden and you plant your plants around your composter. Now you want to make sure to leave yourself some room to access your composter. You want to be able to reach there and you see right here you got that little cover. You want to open up the latch and throw your material in there. So what you do is you simply open up that hatch and you can throw all of your kitchen scraps and all of your leftovers, all of that stuff. This digester has got a double liner. It's made to withstand raccoons and all of that stuff. So, you can feel free to throw in your meats and your bones and, waste moldy cheese. All that stuff can go in this digester. That double liner protects it from most things. So you see this part right over here that looks like a laundry basket? What you do here is you make a hole in the middle of your garden that can fit this laundry basket down in there, and you install your inner liner on top of that, and then your green cone on top of your inner liner. So that double liner protects against raccoons, skunks, and other troublemakers like that. All that material, all those kitchen scraps sit in there, and the worms come in, they eat that, and they come in and out, and they just travel around in your garden bed. They end up living there and enrich the soil all around this composter. So the best place to plant all of your really greedy plants like broccoli, corn, squash, cucumbers, you can plant all of those all around your digester, and they grow really, really well. What you end up doing is creating an all-you-can-eat worm buffet. And worms are good for your garden, so you want to keep them around. So essentially, with this digester, the green cone, you don't need to feel bad about your food waste anymore. All of your food waste ends up being returned to the soil to become more food again. It becomes a resource, no longer a waste. The Kent Regional Service Commission offers these digesters at a good price because they want to encourage people to reduce waste that goes to the landfill. And it's a benefit to the community, it's a benefit to the environment, it's a benefit to the residents who use these digesters. It encourages local food and a shorter, more resilient food supply chain. And these are all things that we value here in Kent County. Thanks for watching.